Okay, music lovers, it's time for us to do lesson 12.1, and I title this West of Iberia, Cross-Cultural Influences in Latin America. As you look at this first slide coming in here, you see a character that you might recognize if you're a Simpsons watcher. And this is Tito Puente. I don't know if you were aware of this if you do watch The Simpsons, but he is a real-life character, and we'll talk more about him as we go through this lesson. First, we need to talk about Iberia and what that means exactly. It is a geographical place on the earth, but where is it exactly? Well, you're going to see a map coming up on the next slide, but it is the peninsula in southwestern Europe that has the modern-day nations of Spain and Portugal. Now, Iberia itself was involved with cultural exchange with West Asia, or what we normally call the Middle East today, through the Moorish influence. And the Moors came from Islamic North Africa. So if you think of Morocco, Algeria, places like that in North Africa, when we did the unit on West Africa, we were dealing with what's often called sub-Saharan Africa, below the Sahara Desert. And those nations that have the Sahara Desert as part of their geographical makeup and the northern coast by the Mediterranean have a tremendous Islamic influence. So Iberia was involved with cultural exchange through those kind of connections. The guitar family, for instance, developed from chordophones of West Asian origin. There's an instrument called the tar, and it became the guitar in Spain. Now we have some distinct regional European influences in Iberia as well. There's a connection between Spain and the British Isles, or a Celtic kind of influence. As a matter of fact, one of the more popular entertainers, musicians over the last decade or so is a guy named Heva, who is, or Hevia, I can't remember how you pronounce it. It might be Hevia, and he is a Celtic bagpiper from Spain. We'll talk more about that. And then there's influences from the rest of Mediterranean Europe, influences from France, Greece, Italy, all kinds of cultural exchange there throughout the Mediterranean. And then we'll need to talk about Spanish and Portuguese colonization in the Western Hemisphere, because that's what's really relevant to this discussion of Latin American music. And by the way, the concept of even calling Mexico, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, calling them Latin America, is a reference to Portuguese, Spanish, French being Latin-based languages. And we also need to talk a lot about Catholic influences. Now, here's our map, and it's been compressed a little bit. It's not quite in perspective, but you see most of the peninsula taken up by Spain, and then the western coast part of the peninsula taken up by Portugal. Now, there are a number of folkloric traditions in Latin America. Often when we think of Latin America in today's popular culture, we're thinking of salsa music, salsa dancing, ballroom dancing, but there are many folkloric traditions in Latin America as well. What we see here is an intersection of Iberian, African, and indigenous Amerindian cultures. Once again, I think we might have spoken about this in an earlier lesson, but the concept of appropriate terms for the indigenous peoples of the Americas used to be called American Indian, then became known as Native American, then became known as First Nations peoples, then Amerindian. And I see an interesting thing in the academy where we tend to talk about Native Americans or First Nations people if we're talking about North America, U.S. and Canada, and Amerindian if we're talking about Mexico and South. More about that later. Now, in each region of Latin America, the dominant culture often determines the mixture of cultural traits, and we'll see that musically, and we'll see it in some other ways too. Now, keep in mind this is a very large region. We're talking about Central America, South America, some American social studies teacher, like when I went to high school way back in the dark ages, they used to talk about Mexico being part of North America. And I think most people have gone away from that, but we might call Mexico Central America, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, etc., Central America, and then South America. And this region of Latin America also takes in the Caribbean. Tremendous diversity of language, instrument inventory, genre repertoire, etc. Now, again, I make a reference to a text that we're not using. You're used to that by now. And when I use this text in the classroom course, that particular chapter focused mostly on the Quichua culture of Chile, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru. Now, if you want to have a really interesting conversation on campus here, go over and see Sister Helena Hannanen in the business department and talk to her about her experiences as a missionary in the Andes in South America and her interactions with the Quichua people. It is in the Andes region. If you're not familiar with the Andes, it's a mountain range. It's pretty much an extension of the Rocky Mountains. I think most of you are familiar with the Rocky Mountains in North America, in Canada and U.S., and that mountain range basically runs down the spine of the western part of the continents. So you have the Andes as the counterpart to the Rockies in South America. We have a number of folkloric and neo-traditional genres that are practiced there. And you can see in this photo on the slide a people that has very heavy indigenous influence. Native Americans from Book of Mormon teachings, we might refer to them as the descendants of the Lamanites. Now, some representative instruments that are kind of intriguing here. We have pan-Latin percussion, and I can't remember the last time we discussed this idea of that pan prefix, but it refers to being across something. So we talk about the Pan American Games, which is like a smaller version of the Olympics for the Western Hemisphere, for the nations of North, South America, and the Caribbean, as the Pan American Games. There used to be a Pan American Airlines before that went bankrupt a while back. We talk about Pan-Pacific string bands in contemporary popular music in the Pacific Islands. And so we have Pan-Latin percussion, things that might have gotten started in specific cultures, specific islands in the Caribbean, and now they're used all across the region. African-derived idiophones such as claves, maracas, güiro, cowbell, and membranophones like bongos, congas, and timbales. We'll look and listen to those more as we go along. We have an instrument called the charango, a guitar-like instrument with 5 courses or matched pairs of strings. That's in the photograph here. It may use an armadillo shell for body, or it can be handcrafted from wood. It can look like a miniature guitar that's actually handcrafted, or it can be used an armadillo shell like this photo here. Kind of interesting. Those of you who are from the Southwest, U.S., or in Mexico or somewhere else in Latin America, you're familiar with this animal. We have the cuatro, which is a 4-string lute chordophone of the guitar family. Let's take a look at a video of the charango, and this is kind of an instructional video showing you how to do certain strums that are characteristic of certain types of songs and the dances that accompany those songs. It's only about 1:40 long, and it gives you a little idea of the look and the sound of this instrument.
Ritmo de saya y caporal. Mano hacia abajo. Mano hacia arriba. Mano hacia abajo. Mano hacia arriba. Mano hacia abajo. Mano hacia abajo. Y mano hacia arriba. Junto al ritmo se escucha así. Ligerito, péscame, ligerito, péscame, ligerito, péscame, ligerito. Soy caminante de las alturas, hasta tu pueblo llegando estoy. Yo vivo cerca de las montañas, cerca del cielo, cerca del sol. Yo vivo cerca de las montañas, cerca del cielo, cerca del sol. Traigo colores, el arco iris, en la huipala de mi nación. Llevo en mis venas la sangre andina, la savia eterna en todo mi ser. Llevo en mis venas la sangre andina, la savia eterna en todo mi ser. Caporales, caporales, desde Bolivia se oye el cantar. Caporales, caporales, raza de bronce, fuerza y amor, raza de bronce, fuerza y amor.
Some other instruments that are characteristic of that region in the Andes, where there's a very prevalent Amerindian influence. We have zampoña, which are the Andean panpipes. We see that in the top photo here. The Spanish term zampoña covers all variations. There were many different versions of this in different cultures and subcultures in the Andean region of South America, and this word zampoña is a Spanish word that covers all of them. Let's take a look and listen to the sound of the zampoña. Okay, this upcoming video is about 6.5 minutes long, and I'm going to ask you to hang in there and watch the whole thing because you're going to see a number of different instruments. First, we start out with very long zampoñas. You might consider them to be like bass zampoñas or baritone zampoñas. You hear kind of the characteristic low sound of those long pipes. And then later on, well, maybe about the 2.5-3 minute mark, you're going to see some alto or soprano, much shorter zampoñas, and then you see the musician switching one to the charango and one to the bamboo flute of the region. So listen or take a look at all this and get a feel for these different indigenous instruments. And I should mention at this point that, of course, some of them are obviously adapted from Western models.